I'm going to make a start, folks, because we have a lot to get through, and I am conscious of the fact that at 1:30 a new group's going to appear and expect me to speak to them about a different topic. So I hope you won't mind me starting very much sort of on the dot. We're going to be talking about historical memory, historical fact and fiction, truth, and what lies do to our understanding not just of the past, but of the present. I am going to make a case that this is one of the most urgent, ongoing subjects that we can study related to Du Bois. I'm also going to make the case that for Du Bois, this was a lifelong occupation, something that he concerned himself with, that was front of mind from almost the moment he started working on his PhD to the moment he breathed his last in 1963. I'm going to begin with words of Martin Luther King, who gave one of his last great speeches at what would have been Du Bois's 100th birthday in 1968 at Carnegie Hall in New York. And I think this is interesting because in a speech dedicated to Du Bois's entire life, King very much centers Black Reconstruction, Du Bois's perhaps ultimate statement against what we're going to call the lost cause myth. And he puts central to understanding Du Bois this idea of historical truth and what history is for, who it speaks for. King said, "To understand why Du Bois's study of Reconstruction was a monumental achievement, it is necessary to see it in context. White historians had for a century crudely distorted the Negro's role in the Reconstruction years. It was a conscious and deliberate manipulation of history, and the stakes were high. One generation after another of Americans were assiduously taught these falsehoods, and the collective mind of America became poisoned with racism and stunted with myths. Dr. Du Bois confronted this powerful structure of historical distortion and dismantled it. He virtually, before anyone else and more than anyone else, demolished the lies about Negroes in their most important and creative period of history." The Lost Cause and W.E.B. Du Bois were and are two very different entities. One was and is an ideology, a fabric of lies, of myths, a white supremacist lens to apply to history and indeed to the present. The other was a person, albeit one of the most remarkable people to have graced this country's history. Both, however, came into being in the late 1860s. They grew and developed alongside one another, ultimately becoming national and indeed international forces. Du Bois would outlive most of the originators of the Lost Cause and certainly all of its heroes, but it would outlive him, and he knew it would. So he left a body of writings and a set of challenges that we can continue to use to battle both the Lost Cause and other willful distortions of American history. Here's a quick overview of Du Bois's career. There he is, the young graduate student there on the left. He has this incredibly propulsive, exciting early career as a superstar academic, top of his class at Fisk, top of his class at Harvard, the first Black man to gain a PhD from Harvard. We all know those stories. He goes to Berlin. He is an absolute driving force in the development of sociology as a discipline. It seems at the turn of the century that Du Bois is going to have a career as one of the foremost scholars in American society, and indeed he will, but he's also going to make this pivot due to the experience of violent Southern racism in and around Atlanta. He becomes involved in public movements, becomes a leader in the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People and the editor of its magazine, The Crisis. And he writes books for a wide audience. And as we'll talk about later, he puts on a show. He decides to take his scholarship and to make it accessible in as many different ways as possible to as many different people as possible. And we're going to talk about the ways he specifically did that in relation to the history of slavery, Civil War, and Reconstruction. And there he is. This is a lifelong story, of course. So there's the young Du Bois in 1900 and the older Du Bois photographed by Carl van Vechten on the right there in the 1940s. Looking back on a career spent jousting with the lost cause, but indeed even looking ahead to more efforts to discredit this white supremacist mythos. So what is this lost cause thing? It's perhaps embodied by this rather romanticized image of Pickett's charge at Gettysburg, but we can think of other images, other people associated with it. We're going to talk about monuments, movies, generals, historians. There's Shelby Foote becoming a national treasure in the Ken Burns documentary, where he was allowed an amazing amount of airtime to present the Lost Cause version of the Civil War to an audience of millions. I'm going to list some key tenets of the Lost Cause. Some will feel immediately familiar. Most of these relate to the memory of the Civil War, but you can notice how many can be retrofitted to sanctify the antebellum, i.e. the slave South, and projected forward onto Reconstruction. So we'll just run through a couple of ideas. The South, according to the Lost Cause, was a place of peaceful, genteel, noble, Christian, virtuous civilization, as independent as it was proud. The white South was nationally unique in its sophistication, romance, aristocratic values, chivalric glamour, and gentlemanly conduct. White Southern women were paragons of virtue, and their men were courteous and brave defenders of their honor. Slavery is depicted in typical Lost Cause representations as a cheerful and harmonious relationship between benevolent whites and simple black folk, existing within a kind of agrarian, happy space, independent of any capitalism or anything sinister like that. The war, when it came, was brought about by northern aggression and big government. It is often referred to as the War of Northern Aggression, and it was an example of federal overreach. The war aims of the South were states' rights and independence, not the preservation of slavery, according to the Lost Cause. White Southerners during this fight were imbued with greater martial prowess than their northern counterparts. They would have won, they should have won, had the North not had unfair advantages. In contrast to the happy and loyal enslaved people, freedmen and black citizens after Reconstruction are depicted as dangerous, rapacious, lazy, stupid, corrupt, cruel, and untrustworthy. White Northerners are depicted as vengeful, insensitive, barbarous, avaricious, and undemocratic in their triumphalist behavior following the war. Things were better before the war, says the Lost Cause. And obviously that means things were better before Reconstruction. During the war, it could be sublime when things went the Confederate way. In defeat and after, all was ruin and hopelessness. And in all of this, the South is united, the white South. Everyone is on the same page. Everyone is for the Confederacy. Everyone who can is wearing a uniform. Reconstruction was a terrible idea, which imposed martial law and majority black rule that was uniformly ruinous to the South. It was also corrupt, criminal, and socially corroding. We've all seen this before. If we take the film Gone with the Wind, it's all in there, every single thing I've mentioned. However, this is in my interpretation. We could add more categories, but what I really want to focus in on at this juncture is we can easily disprove everything I've just said with hard, undeniable historical facts. Slavery as a casus belli was all over the declarations of secession. Alexander Stephens, the vice president of the Confederacy, called white supremacy the cornerstone, quote unquote, of the entire project. Lincoln famously recognized slavery as the cause of the war in his second inaugural, and this wasn't really questioned at the time. On the question of supposed Southern military prowess relative to that of the North, I'll just say that anyone who believes in inherent Confederate martial brilliance has obviously never studied the career of General Braxton Bragg. In fact, the history of the whole Western theater of operations makes for pretty grim reading for anyone seeking tales of Southern military genius. On the Reconstruction point, well, just read Du Bois. But remember, there was never black rule in the South at any point during Reconstruction. This idea, this picture of legislatures dominated by unqualified, corrupt black legislators is a complete fabrication. I could go on. The point is this. We're not dealing with mere historical interpretation here, a set of arguments trying to make sense of murky or hard to interpret events. This is a tapestry of lies, deliberate distortions, and absolute fictions, which anyone could puncture in a second. by consulting the primary sources. So how did this big lie become such an accepted part of the American historical imagination? The term lost cause, as applies to the Confederacy, was coined in the immediate aftermath of the war. In 1867, the year before Du Bois was born, Edward A. Pollard, the wartime editor of the Richmond Examiner, published The Lost Cause, a new Southern history of the War of the Confederates. This idea, began to really take hold, and it had appeal not just for Southerners, but let's start with Southerners. The Lost Cause ennobles the Confederacy. It makes gods out of people who betrayed their country and fought for white supremacy, like Stonewall Jackson. There was a genuine need for remembrance, after all. These people, these bereaved mothers, sisters, fathers, sons, etc., had to have something to attach to the people who had quite literally died or been maimed. There had to be some ideal found to make sense of all this relentless suffering. And for this, I highly recommend Drew Gilpin's Faust's book, This Republic of Suffering, which is all about the American process of grief following the Civil War. As I mentioned, this has a romantic appeal. The 19th century is full of tales of heroism and defeat around the world. It's not just in the United States. We have the Alamo here, of course, and there are misadventures by other colonial forces around the world, such as the British in Sudan, which have an immense sort of romantic appeal to the white imagination. And just to sort of start, just to stay briefly before we get to reconciliation on this nationalistic point, war, when it happens, to come back to these images I showed you before of the widows, of the soldiers, etc., it needs some kind of justification after the fact that's beyond pure, immediate kind of a need for wealth or power, or there need to be grander ideals attached to it. And so Southern nationalism too is lent credibility by the Lost Cause. And that's what I mentioned earlier about this American exceptionalism within American exceptionalism of the South. If one sees the South, the Confederacy, as a true nation rather than as a breakaway section, the historical interlocutor is more likely to accept the validity of their actions. There's a really famous essay by David M. Potter, The Historian's Use of Nationalism and Vice Versa, where he says the attribution of nationalism by historians ceases to be a merely descriptive matter and becomes an evaluative matter, for the verdict upon the act performed by the group depends upon the character of the group performing the act. Potter goes on, when the historian attributes nationality to any group, he establishes a presumption in favor of any acts involving an exercise of autonomy that the group may commit. When he denies nationality, he establishes a presumption against any exercise of autonomy. The attribution of nationality, therefore, involves a sanction for the exercise of autonomy or self-determination. Put another way, if you are credentialed, i.e., if you have a nation, an ideal, you can do some quite horrid things. And I think the framers of the Lost Cause are very aware of that. But I want to talk about how this becomes a national idea, a national myth that has broad appeal across white America. And much of this happens in the late era of blue-gray reunions. And there's a famous one 50 years after the war at Gettysburg, which is pictured here. And this has a legacy that goes far beyond the 19-teens. As late as the 1980s, one of the best and most brilliant historians of the war, Bruce Catton, a Northerner and a New Deal progressive, nevertheless wrote this staggering passage. He says, quote, "I think the legend of the Lost Cause has served the entire country very well. The things that were done during the Civil War have not been forgotten, of course, but we now see them through a veil." An interesting choice of words. "We have elevated the entire conflict to a realm where it is no longer explosive. It is a part of American legend, a part of American history, a part, if you will, of American romance. It moves men mightily to this day, but it does not move them in the direction of picking up their guns and going at it again." How wrong can one be? Reconciliation helps the myth become national. This is a crucial ingredient in its enduring success. And this is where what David Blight calls a ritual unlike any other that had occurred in America happens in 1913. Following these myths of unification and making remembering safe, this festival at Gettysburg was designed as a monument to sectional reconciliation and patriotism. A total of 53,407 veterans attended. The London Times wrote that the veterans were eradicating forever the scars of the Civil War in a way that no amount of preaching or political maneuvering could have done. The planners, of course, had allowed no space for black veterans and no space on the program for the discussions of the failures of Reconstruction. The 1913 Peace Jubilee, as the organizers called it, was in David Blight's words again, a Jim Crow reunion, and white supremacy might be said to have been the silent, invisible master of ceremonies. The Washington Bee, a black newspaper published from 1882 to 1922, wrote, quote, "A reunion of whom? Those who fought to destroy the Union and perpetuate slavery, and who are now employing every artifice and argument known to deceit and sophistry to propagate a national sentiment in favor of their nefarious contention that emancipation, Reconstruction, and enfranchisement are a dismal failure." When asked to say what the 50 years since the war had meant, President Woodrow Wilson said in his speech at this gathering, "They have meant peace and union and vigor and the maturity and might of a great nation. We have found one another again as brothers and comrades in arms, enemies no longer, generous friends rather, our battles long past, the quarrel forgotten, except that we shall not forget the splendid valor, the manly devotion of men that are arrayed against each other, now grasping hands and smiling into each other's eyes." But why is this so important at the close of the 19th century, at the beginning of the 20th century? According to Latrice Donaldson, who was a former Du Bois Center fellow, the end of the 19th century did represent something of a national crisis of manhood. Whether real or imagined, she says, American men in their minds apparently had become soft and they needed a war. The Lost Cause provided a blueprint for tough, white, martial masculinity that was eagerly embraced by many soldiers at the time, including a young George S. Patton. Patton, of course, in a much later war, became the image of the American military man, par excellence. As a youth, he was deeply steeped in Lost Cause romanticism and sought inspiration from ancestors who had fought for the Confederacy. The war that Latrice Donaldson is talking about is the Spanish-American War. This was a nakedly imperialistic war, as was the wars conducted all over the American frontier against indigenous nations, which also drew on a kind of lost cause ideology in the shape, weirdly enough, of a former Union veteran who was killed in 1876, George Armstrong Custer. The reconciliation narrative was important, though, as white Americans joined forces to complete the settler colonial project of this country's continental identity and to start to exert itself as an imperial power, again along white supremacist lines. This is lent a lot of credo, I think, by a couple of pieces of evidence. Many of the Union veterans were against some of the harsher measures of Reconstruction. And you have in the 1880s Confederate veterans coming out and being very enthusiastic for an international war. They see this as their chance to get back into the fold, so to speak. John B. Gordon, a former Confederate general, an ardent evangelist of the Lost Cause, and indeed a Ku Klux Klan member, said at a speech in Cleveland, Ohio, quote, "I have sometimes thought that I would be willing to see one more war, just one more, and that we might march under the stars and stripes, shoulder to shoulder against a common foe." And so the Spanish-American War came along at just the right times. Gaines M. Foster writes that Southerners who sought both to vindicate the Confederate soldier and to reunify the nation might have staged the Spanish-American War if it had not come along when it did. The war provided an opportunity to diminish and undermine the value and the valor and the bravery of black troops, which a narrative that was colluded in by Theodore Roosevelt, who used his role in the war to launch himself into a political career. Another piece of evidence, funnily enough, comes from Hollywood. In the 1950s, the American Western was one of, if not the most popular genre of Hollywood. And so many Westerns feature Civil War veterans joining together or navigating the memory of the Civil War as they complete their project to subjugate indigenous peoples. This is just a selection of images from some classic Westerns. The two on the right actually come from an offbeat 60s Western that plays with this idea of Confederate prisoners being brought into a Union unit to go and pursue hostile Apaches south of the border. It becomes an allegory for Vietnam, but nonetheless, the idea of Confederates and Unionists sort of uneasily forming alliances to fight together on the frontier had established itself as enough of a narrative at that point to become very significant. The two films in the middle are two of the classic American Westerns, The Searchers above, She Wore a Yellow Ribbon Below. Both take great pains to examine the Civil War. In the Below film, She Wore a Yellow Ribbon, a Confederate veteran now fighting in blue is laid to rest with full honors, including a Confederate flag. In the Above film, Ethan Edwards, the hero of the picture, a flawed man presented as such by the film, nevertheless has the line at the beginning, "I don't believe in surrenders." What is the purpose of all of this, really? We're sort of talking around it. The project of Reconstruction was to try in some form and fashion to bring about a greater level of racial equality than had hitherto existed in the United States. The project, therefore, of the Lost Cause was to undermine this and to redraw the color line and make Jim Crow racism an accepted fact across the entire nation. I want to illustrate this in the case of the so-called Battle of Liberty Place, which took place in 1874. This was an attempted coup, an insurrection much like that of January the 6th, 2021, against a democratically elected Republican state government in Louisiana. It took place in New Orleans, which was the capital of Louisiana at the time. 5,000 members of the so-called White League stormed and occupied government buildings for 3 days before the arrival of federal troops and the reinstatement of the government. No insurgents were charged in the wake of the uprising, despite it resulting in numerous fatalities. Doesn't sound familiar, does it? This obelisk was erected in 1891 and placed in a prominent location on Canal Street in New Orleans. It was used throughout the 20th century as a rallying point for the Ku Klux Klan and other white supremacist groups. David Duke called it a symbol of white pride. And the anger over its 2017 removal was so intense that this had to be done in the dead of night by workers under heavy police guard. The inscription reads, "United States troops took over the state government and reinstated the usurpers, but the national election, November 1876, recognized white supremacy in the South and gave us our state." There it is. White supremacy and the Lost Cause are very explicit bedfellows up until really the era of the New Deal and the Second World War and the Civil Rights Movement, when it starts to disguise itself a bit. But there is no question that this ideology, this mythos, is being created to bolster Jim Crow racism. It helped to create an ideological underpinning of a post-slavery racial apartheid in the South, and in becoming a nationally accepted myth, the Lost Cause helped preserve the color line throughout the country. It helped ensure that white and black workers were kept divided nationally by the color line and thereby prevented from organizing together for their common rights. This played neatly into the hands of a nationwide, not just Southern now, oligarchy, which we shall talk more about later. So if we cast our minds back to the series of tenets of the Lost Cause I listed earlier, we can see how all this fits together. The faithful, happy slave narrative supports the idea that the natural order of things is one where there is a racial hierarchy with whites on top. Denying black people a role in the past, aside from being mute bystanders, is a handy way of denying them a role in the present. White people, being the supposed victims of the Civil War, justifies their subsequent and sometimes violent reactions. If Reconstruction is accepted as an ill-judged and catastrophic failure, and one moreover imposed on a part of the nation by the federal government, it makes resistance to other national efforts to impose civil rights so much easier. James Loven makes the point that the success of the Lost Cause in fighting for a national doctrine of white supremacism can be seen in the sudden decision in the 1890s by the Republican Party to stop defending racial equality. Up to that point, he argues, when accused of being miscegenationist or soft on race or being labeled in other hatefully racist terms and ways, the party would defend its position and attack Southern racism. In the 1890s, however, when accused of being friends of Black Americans, the Republican Party answer shifted to, no, we're not. All of this needed academic backing. Herbert Apteker, Du Bois's great friend and comrade, writes in his introduction to a documentary history of the Negro people in the United States, a Jim Crow society breeds and needs a Jim Crow historiography. The dominant historiography in the United States either omits the Negro people or presents them as a people without a past, as a people who have been docile, passive, parasitic, imitative. This picture is a lie. The Negro people, the most oppressed of all people in the United States, have been militant, active, creative, and productive. This was as Du Bois's efforts were, this flew against the accepted narrative presented by American historians, many of whom were enormously powerful. William Archibald Dunning had a whole school named after him, a school of historians founded for him at Columbia University. He was able to train and propagate, a group of graduate students who later became influential historians and start to make the Lost Cause version of history accepted academic doctrine. You have the biographer, Douglas Southall Freeman of Robert E. Lee, who helped rehabilitate and make a national hero out of the most vivid symbol of the Confederacy. Freeman was so enamored with his subject that every morning as he was driving or walking to work in Richmond, Virginia, he would pause and salute the statue of Robert E. Lee. And that is not a lie. There is a photo of him doing it. And we'll talk about Claude G. Bowers in a bit, but let's refresh our palates a little bit with Du Bois now. He starts almost immediately with his doctoral thesis, The Suppression of the African Slave Trade. And he's taking on falsified historiography in ways that we'll come to when he's at Harvard. The Souls of Black Folk, which we'll also talk about, was also a response to the academic Lost Cause. But his first kind of real, truly scholarly academic statement against the Dunning framework was Reconstruction and Its Benefits, which was published in the American Historical Review in 1910. It was a direct challenge, and many have to the Lost Cause, and many have identified this article as a sort of forefather of Black Reconstruction. It's a spirited defense of Reconstruction as a source of positive change for all Americans, Black and white. It defends Black suffrage and participation in government, and it does so with, as you would expect, great literary skill, but also an array of facts and figures and statistics and quotes. Du Bois pulls his punches a bit, though, perhaps because he knows he's writing for a white publication, one that has shown a great deal of friendliness to Lost Cause writers. Interestingly, perhaps unrelated, this is the first and only essay by a Black writer to be published in the American Historical Review for nearly 70 years. So take from that what you will. It calls out the white South, quote, "When it saw the reform movement growing, and even in some cases triumphing, and a larger and larger number of Black voters learning to vote for honesty and ability, the white South still preferred a reign of terror to a campaign of education," writes Du Bois. In his 1924 book, The Gift of Black Folk, Du Bois presented several arguments about Black participation in American history and culture, which also flew in the face of the Lost Cause narrative. Among these were ideas introduced in Reconstruction and Its Benefits, which would be expanded on in Black Reconstruction, such as the crucial role played by Black people in their own emancipation, their role in winning the Civil War, how Reconstruction brought democracy, education, and public schools to a region hitherto controlled by an oligarchy, and how Black political participation acted on behalf of poor people across the color line. We'll come back to, remember Claude G. Bowers on the right there. I'm going to quote Claire Parfait, who wrote a wonderful book history of Black Reconstruction before I get to Bowers, because she said, and we have to look at the other side of the coin now. We talked about white historians, but what of Black historians? Parfait said, for African-American historians of the 19th and first half of the 20th century, the goal of writing history was as evident as the stakes were great. Amateur and later professional historians dedicated themselves to the proposition of writing African-American history into mainstream American history, to instilling pride in the African-American community and its roots, and to correcting popular misrepresentations while also addressing the issues and problems specific to their time and place. It was most emphatically history with an agenda. Du Bois had been asked to write the main entry on the American Negro for the 14th edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica in 1929. His paragraph on Reconstruction was objected to by the American editor Franklin Henry Hooper, who claimed that the passage reflected Du Bois's opinion rather than the historical consensus. The dispute was not resolved, and Du Bois was not included at all in the encyclopedia. At the very same time, Claude Bowers's book, The Tragic Era, was published and became the most widely read book on Reconstruction for more than a generation. Bowers did little in the book to hide his sympathy for the white South, and there is evidence to suggest that, as well as buttressing the interpretation of the past espoused by the Lost Cause, he hoped that the book's success would check the progress made by the Republican Party in the South in the late 1920s. The book presented the Republican Party as bent on national domination at the expense of the Jeffersonian principles of the rights of the individual states, to resist centralized government, while arguing that the enfranchisement of Black people was a catastrophic error. None of Bowers' arguments were especially new, but unlike the works produced by the Dunning School for a largely academic audience, his book was calibrated for broad public readership. He was a skillful writer, and his careful use of sources made readers feel both compelled and convinced by his narrative. The book, when I say careful, I mean selective. The book reached an audience immeasurably larger than had the Dunning School and was taken much more seriously than earlier fictional accounts. The Tragic Era produced concern and outrage in equal measure among Black historians. A letter published in The Crisis thundered, "Mr. Bowers repeats ad nauseam that the former slaveholders understood the Negro best and were his best friends. In rebuttal, let it be shown that they understood him worst, and that they were, and their spiritual descendants are, the worst enemies of the Negro struggling towards manliness and equality with his fellows." Anna Julia Cooper penned a letter to Du Bois on December 31st, 1929, in which she wrote that it seems to me that the tragic era should be answered adequately, fully, ably, finally, and it seems to me thou art the man. Take it up seriously through the crisis. Du Bois saw value in the suggestion, but answered Cooper to say that it would take substantial funds, the like of which could only be raised by the sellings of 10,000 extra copies of the crisis. Perhaps unsurprisingly, no special edition of the magazine ever appeared, answering Bowers' book. But there can be no doubt that the Tragic Era was an important catalyst for prompting Du Bois to write Black Reconstruction. In November 1930, Du Bois wrote a letter to Edgar H. Webster, referring to the Tragic Era as, quote, "story of the South told with passion and conviction by a Southerner, which presented only a part of the entire narrative. The story of Reconstruction," wrote Du Bois, "from the point of view of the Negro is yet to be written. When it is written, one may read the tragedy and get the truth." It is clear by this point, while agreeing with Cooper that he was the man to deliver the answer to the Tragic Era, he felt that this should take the form of a book. Just over a month later, on December 19th, 1930, Du Bois followed up with an informal application to Edwin R. Embry at the Julius Rosenwald Fund about the possibility of obtaining a grant to write his history of Reconstruction. An application followed in January of 1931, in which he stated his intention that his work should be, quote, "literature and not simply mechanical history. That is, while based upon unassailable foundation of fact, I want it to be an interpretation of the human soul, down in language which is intelligent and beautiful." And I think anyone who's read Black Reconstruction can agree that he succeeded. The Rosenwald Fund approved Du Bois's application, and Harcourt, Brace and Company agreed to publish the book. In an outline of the book from 1931, which we have here in the archives at UMass, Du Bois makes it clear that Black Reconstruction will seek to correct historical distortions, including, quote, that the South was not really pro-slavery, that it was moving toward the emancipation of the slave, and that Northern politicians were actuated not by philanthropy for Blacks, but by hatred and jealousy of the South and greed for gain in a new industrial era. That moreover, the Negro and slavery were but minor incidents in American history, which today can well be ignored and forgotten. He writes that, quote, fairy tales have been embalmed and sanctified as absolute truth, and with haste and suspicious unanimity, a complete theory of the history of Reconstruction has been written, finished, and made unanswerable and unassailable. Another former Du Bois Center fellow, Charisse Burton-Stelly, has written the tome, Black Reconstruction, aimed not only to craft a comprehensive, critical, and truthful study of the Civil War and Reconstruction, but also to develop a science of history that arraigned extant American historical practice. Such a science would combat white historians' tendency to document only what they wished to remember, to defend the racism of the South and to erase slavery from the history of the US. It would also refute popular academic myths, including that the South did not really support slavery and was actually moving towards emancipation at the time of the Civil War, and that slavery was an insignificant period in American history that could be omitted or forgotten. The entire book is a presentation of this truthful version of the Civil War, Emancipation, and Reconstruction, an indirect refutation of the lost cause historiography through most of its narrative, although he sometimes pauses, Du Bois, to take issue with a specific corner of this particular myth. But he actually devotes an entire final chapter, The Propaganda of History, the title of this particular lecture, to a direct attack on the lost cause and specifically its academic defenders. He says, I stand at the end of this writing, literally aghast at what American historians have done to this field. He says, if history is going to be scientific, if the record of human action is going to be set down with that accuracy and faithfulness of detail which will allow its use as a measuring rod and guidepost for the future of nations, there must be set some standards of ethics and research and interpretation. If, on the other hand, we are going to use history for our pleasure and amusement, for inflating our national ego and giving us a false but pleasurable sense of accomplishment, then we must give up the idea of history either as a science or as an art using the results of science, and admit frankly that we are using a version of historic fact in order to influence and educate the new generation along the way we wish. To influence and educate the new generation along the way we wish. We shall never have a science of history until we have in our colleges men who regard the truth as more important than the defense of the white race, and who will not deliberately encourage students to gather thesis material in order to support a prejudice or buttress a lie. Gerald Horne, the great Gerald Horne, calls Black Reconstruction the solid foundation for the emergence of like-minded scholars from Eric Williams to Philip S. Foner and Walter Rodney. Black Reconstruction also revealed the shortcomings, as we mentioned before, but it helped to really sort of clean the slate and lay the ground for future subsequent revisionary texts, many of which Gerald Horne himself has written, that could thoroughly rewrite this history. In the wake of Du Bois's book, says Gerald Horne, our view of Reconstruction would never be the same. Martin Luther King, in that same speech, said, history cannot ignore W.E.B. Du Bois because history has to reflect truth, and Du Bois was a tireless explorer and a gifted discoverer of social truths. His singular greatness lay in his quest for truth about his own people. There were very few scholars who concerned themselves with honest study of the black man, and he sought to fill this immense void. The degree to which he succeeded discloses the great dimensions of the man. Now, I promised also to talk about other ways in which Du Bois fought the lost cause, and we're running low on time, so I'm going to spend less time delving into the quite hair-raising quotes from some of the books written by Southern writers, like Thomas Nelson Page, who was an absolute bestseller of books which painted this rosy, gone with the wind view of the South, complete with racist Negro dialect, which Page himself would imitate when he was doing public readings of the book. He's perhaps in part forgotten now because of the success of Gone with the Wind itself, which was, before it was a long and turgid blockbuster, a long and turgid book written by an avowed white supremacist who would leave her black made on the street when she went for meetings with the Ku Klux Klan. Enough about those people. David Blight writes that no writer offered a more artful challenge to the hegemony of lost cause ideology than W.E.B. Du Bois. In The Souls of Black Folk, I think he gives us one of the most brilliant and beautiful counter images to that kind of pro-Southern vision of the end of the war, when he fictionalizes a historical truth, where he writes, he doesn't write about specific people, but he takes two archetypes and he renders them in an artful snapshot. It's an old former plantation owner and an elderly formerly enslaved woman. These two figures ever stand to typify, writes Du Bois, that day to coming ages. The one, a grey-haired gentleman whose fathers had quit themselves like men, whose sons lay in nameless graves, who bowed to the evils of slavery because its abolition threatened untold ill to all, who stood at last in the evening of life, a blighted, ruined form with hate in his eyes, and the other, a form hovering dark and mother-like, her awful face, black with the mists of centuries, had aforetime quailed at the white master's command, had bent in love over the cradles of his sons and daughters, and closed in death the sunken eyes of his wife. I, too, at his behest, had laid herself low to his lust, and borne a tawny man-child to the world, only to see her dark boy's limbs scattered to the wind by midnight marauders. These were the saddest sights of that woeful day, and no man clasped the hands of these two passing figures of the present past. But hating, they went to their long home, and hating their children's children, live today. Du Bois continues to write fiction throughout his career, and often returns to ideas that take issue with the Page or Margaret Mitchell vision of this era, and nowhere more so than in the first volume of his Black Flame trilogy, which he writes very late in life. The Ordeal of Mansart, the first book of the trilogy, in some ways can be seen as a novelization of Black Reconstruction. In the postscript to this volume, Du Bois writes, "I'm trying by the method of historical fiction to complete the cycle of history which has for half a century engaged my thought, research, and action." Yes, so historical fiction had achieved a new hold on the American imagination with the birth of Hollywood. In the first volume of Mansart's mentions in passing one of the most seismically influential cultural expressions of the lost cause, which took the shape of a 1915 film. Writes Du Bois, "Then came The Birth of a Nation, that splendid new effort at moving pictures, which unfortunately centered the race problem and aroused the passions of the mob. Negro audiences shrank at the wild ride of the Ku Klux Klan to rescue the white girl. They knew just what the white world was thinking. Race, prejudice, and the lost cause were given an absolutely unprecedented national, indeed international platform with this film, directed by D.W. Griffith. Birth of a Nation was the first to cost $100,000 to produce. It was the first to be shown at the White House. It was the first to be screened for Supreme Court justices and members of Congress. It was viewed by millions of Americans and may eventually have been seen by a worldwide audience of over 200 million people. It dramatized the end of the Civil War and the early Reconstruction period, presenting hatefully racist depictions of black people throughout and making heroes of the Klan. A real-world effect of the film was to breathe new life into this organization. In the words of Melvin Stokes, a professor of film history at the University College London, quote, "With an assist from Birth of the Nation, the new Ku Klux Klan was launched. Birth of a Nation was the midwife in the rebirth of the most vicious terrorist organization in the history of the United States." There is a bump in membership that you can see in 1915 and beyond. It was used as a recruitment tool for the Klan as late as the 1970s. For Black Americans and supporters of racial equality, the film's success and the seal of approval that had been bestowed upon it by the U.S. government were causes for outrage and alarm. The NAACP, in its early years now, began to mobilize protests against the film even before its release. Du Bois was present, along with several other NAACP leaders, at a hearing held about the film at City Hall in New York that was attended by 500 people. Over the following months, the crisis under Du Bois's direction became a focal point for a national protest movement against the film. The magazine traced the various efforts to have the film banned and censored across the country, and Du Bois used his editorials to rail against the picture, calling it vicious on several occasions. In the May 1915 issue, he argued that, quote, the whole second half of the play ought to be suppressed, and the association will work to this end. In the October issue, he printed a cartoon captioned The Verdict, where the defendant, Thomas Dixon, author of the play on which the film is based, faces the jury who hold up a scroll on which is written, quote, as a historian, we find the defendant a pretty good liar. The jury is made up of fire-minded Americans, said the caption. Du Bois laments that the NAACP had failed to kill the film in the accompanying editorial, but is glad that the efforts of the association have at least succeeded in wounding it. And on and on and on. And one of the final things he writes about Birth of a Nation in The Crisis is, our fight is not yet over. Briefly on Gone with the Wind, many of us are familiar with that, maybe more so than Birth of a Nation. It opens, with this great statement about the antebellum South. Here was a land of cavaliers and cotton fields. Here in this pretty world, gallantry took its last bow. Here was the last to be seen of knights and their ladies fair, of master and slave. Look for it only in books, for it is no more than a dream remembered. In 1940, a student from the Chico State College in California wrote a letter of praise to Du Bois about Black Reconstruction. In the letter, the student is perplexed that the book Gone with the Wind was so popular in the North. He argues that a more apt title would be Gone with the Truth. And in 1948, Dalton Trumbo, who remember was jailed under McCarthyism, under the Red Scare, wrote, the most gigantic milestones to Hollywood's appeal to public patronage have been anti-Negro pictures like The Birth of a Nation and Gone with the Wind. I mentioned The Crisis. One unintended consequence, really, of Birth of a Nation is that it really helps to coalesce the NAACP on a single issue across the country. It gives them something to rally around and sense of energy. And also it's a popular debate. There are white audiences defending the film, and everyone is excited by this early expression, I guess one would say, of the American culture war. So the NAACP gets more attention. It also gets a sense of being tied together as the different chapters communicate about what they're doing in their specific communities to combat the film. But of course, what ties all of this together, the connective tissue, is The Crisis magazine, which Du Bois edited for a quarter of the century. And he uses this as a platform to criticize lost cause figures and ideals throughout his editorship. He also publicizes his pageant, The Star of Ethiopia, which, although written before Birth of a Nation was premiered, was performed mostly after the film came out and has to be seen in some ways as a statement against the D.W. Griffith picture. So, monuments and historical memory. So we've talked about academic history, we've talked about novels, we've talked about movies. We could talk about television, the Dukes of Hazzard, et cetera, but we won't go there. I want to talk about monuments because, again, this is very much alive in our current imagination, and it's a big talking point across the country, specifically in the South. And we have to talk about the role of women. It's important to understand the centrality of women in the history of the antebellum South. They were such a big part of the slave society as direct investors in it. Stephanie E. Jones-Rogers has demonstrated this in They Were Her Property. They weren't just these simpering bystanders with fans. They were people with a real financial stake in the survival of this oligarchical system. Jones-Rogers argues that understanding that the direct economic investments of white women in slavery and how they benefited from it helps us to understand their desire to, after the war, uphold a white supremacist order. If we acknowledge that white women stood to personally and directly benefit from the commodification and enslavement of African Americans, we can better understand their participation in post-war white supremacist movements, in lynchings, and their membership of the Ku Klux Klan. You can read primary sources, women's Civil War diaries. They are rife with this kind of a sense of not just oh no, what's happening, but a real outrage at a world that's been taken apart, one that they directly benefit from. One I recommend is a diary of a Louisiana woman called Kate Stone. She says in this diary, if nothing else can force us to battle on for freedom, the thousands of grass-grown mounds heaped on mountainsides and in every valley of our country should teach us to emulate the heroes who lie beneath. And this idea of emulating the heroes, the women couldn't go to war, but they could continue the war afterwards in place of the men who had died. This is such a founding idea of the United Daughters of the Confederacy, which far outstrips the Sons of Confederate Veterans as an influential former of everything to do with the Lost Cause as a civic religion in the South. Of course, one of its most public expressions are these stone monuments, but also they breathed life into organizations like the Ku Klux Klan. According to a piece by Greg Huffman in the online magazine Facing South, the UDC venerated the Klan and elevated it to a nearly mythical status. They dealt in and preserved Klan artifacts and symbology. They even served as a sort of public relations agency for this terrorist group. In 1926, they would erect a memorial to the Klan near Highway 15, not far from Concord, North Carolina. It seems to have since been either lost, stolen, or overgrown, but we know it existed because the UDC have meticulous record keeping. Henry Louis Gates writes, no single group or person was more pivotal to the dissemination of the truths of Confederate history, in inverted commas, earnestly and fully and officially than the historian general of the United Daughters of the Confederacy, Mildred Lewis Rutherford of Athens, Georgia. She, there on the left, came from a long line of slaveholders. That is how she dressed. She came from a long line of slaveholders. She was the vice president of the Stone Mountain Memorial Project and author of the 1920 book, Truths of History, a fair, unbiased, impartial, unprejudiced, and conscientious conscientious study of American history. I think it gives it away a little bit. The table of contents reads as a sort of 10 commandments almost for the Lost Cause. They had headings like, the North was responsible for the war between the states. Chapter 3, the slaves were not ill-treated in the South, and the North was largely responsible for their presence in the South. Chapter 5, the South has never had her rightful place in literature. Chapter 6, the North violated the Constitution and refused to stand by the decisions of the Supreme Court, this drove the South to secession, on and on, ad nauseam. Rutherford, says David Blight, gives new meaning to the term die hard. She considered the Confederacy acquitted as blameless at the bar of history, he writes, and sought its vindication with a political fervor that would rival the Ministry of Propaganda in any 20th century dictatorship. In an address to the United Daughters of the Confederacy, The Wrongs of History righted, she says, the slaveholder felt a personal responsibility in caring for his slaves physically, mentally, morally, and spiritually. By the way, we never called them slaves. They were our people, our Negroes, part of our very homes. These efforts, I think, helped enshrine the Lost Cause as what Thomas Reagan Wilson calls a civic religion. By the way, notice that the cannon points outward at their headquarters in Richmond. The civic religion piece. This is just one pamphlet produced by the UDC, which I found in the archives of the Center for Studying Structures of Race at Roanoke College, Virginia. These guys are in a much more beleaguered part of the country than we are, but they're nonetheless partners of the Du Bois Center, and we're very proud of them. They keep a Lost Cause archive, and in it I found this catechism, talk about civic religion, where the commandments of the Lost Cause, the ways to teach Southern history are laid out in detail. Here's another example, Children of the Confederacy, never mind that doesn't exist anymore, in 1947, with a calendar of feast days and what to do each month and who to venerate, and on and on and on. The UDC were particularly active when it came to commissioning and erecting monuments, and it was in this arena that Du Bois, was able to take them on directly. What were the monuments for? Saida Grundy argues that, quote, Confederate memorials were fashioned well into the 20th century, not by those seeking to grieve any one individual, but rather by those who wanted to send a message about racial politics in the present. The memorials were built not in the immediate aftermath of the war, but they were built in the immediate aftermath of Plessy versus Ferguson, of the imposition of Jim Crow apartheid in the South. They were not monuments to defeat. They were monuments to a victory of white supremacism in this part of the country, and they were erected in very large part to remind everyone of this newly imposed racial order. And one of the most popular subjects for memorialization was Robert E. Lee. There is the statue as it was in Richmond that Douglas Southall Freeman used to salute. That's a picture I took in 2022. It's no longer there. Local residents worried that the statue being taken away would harm property values. Here he is, Robert E. Lee. In The Crisis in 1928, Du Bois writes, Lee's personal comeliness, his aristocratic birth, and his military prowess all call for the verdict of greatness and genius. But one terrible fact militates against this, and that is the inescapable truth that Robert E. Lee led a bloody war to perpetuate human slavery. And he talks about, well, people have said that maybe he didn't fight for slavery, he fought for Virginia, he fought for states' rights. Du Bois writes, no, people do not go to war for abstract theories of government, they fight for property and privilege, and Lee fought for those things. It is ridiculous to seek to excuse Lee as the most formidable agency this nation ever raised to make 4 million human beings goods instead of men. Either he knew that slavery meant what slavery meant when he helped maim and murder thousands in its defense, or he did not. If he did not, he was a fool. If he did, he was a traitor and a rebel, not indeed to his country, but to humanity and humanity's God. We don't have time to dwell on all the ways in which I got to experience Lee's memorial when I went to Washington and Lee University on a very sunny day in 2022, the same day as the midterms that year, if you can believe it. But I was taken to what the ladies who run the site and who are very much not have very much not drunk the Kool-Aid of the Lost Cause, are referred to as ground zero of the Lost Cause. And if you'll indulge me, I did a little module on tomb sculpture once for art history. Notice here that Lee is not dead in this rendering. He's nearly asleep, his hand on his chest. Dead people don't have their hands on their chest. His other hand resting on his sword, ready at any moment to spring up and defend the South again. This is an absurd monument, and it was really where all the others sprang from. It was incredible to be in its presence at this institution of higher learning that's right next to the Virginia Military Academy, worryingly, Institute, I mean. Even Robert E. Lee's horse has a gravestone, and if you'll allow me just one anecdote, I know we're running out of time. The horse, Traveller, which Robert E. Lee was indelibly associated with, after Lee's death, trod on a rusty nail and got tetanus. Now, someone had to put the horse out of its misery, but no one could be found that would willingly execute Robert E. Lee's mythic mount. Even Lee's son, Fitzhugh Lee, when given the opportunity to do so, demurred. He couldn't do it. And so poor old Traveller was a victim of the lost cause, of the mythology surrounding his owner, and had to die a hopelessly painful and drawn-out death because of this. So another real-world consequence right there of what we're talking about. Here are some other monuments. Stone Mountain, I think many people know. The Silent Sam Monument is relevant to us because it was erected by the United Daughters of the Confederacy at an institution of higher learning, that being the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. It was there to commemorate student soldiers. Of course, many of the students, as Adam Dombey has shown in his recent book on this subject, at the university actually wanted their drafts deferred, did not want to serve in the Confederacy. So the UDC created a mythology where all students willingly stepped out of the classroom and into the ranks. The sculpture was torn down in 1918. It was erected in 2018. It was erected in 1913. So it stood for nearly over 100 years. Very prominent place. Some people refer to it as the front door of the university. At the dedication, the band played Dixie. And the speech in its honor was given by a regular speaker at these events, Julian Shakespeare Carr, who was a philanthropist, an industrialist, a former Confederate soldier, but only briefly. He had also had his draft deferred and only served for a year, an avowed white supremacist and a Klan supporter. He said, "The whole Southland is sanctified by the precious blood of the student Confederate soldier." And he talks about how noble they are, how brave, and how they were knights of the Holy Grail. They endured for the reward of enduring. They fought for the reward of duty done. They served, they suffered, they endured, and on and on. However, the lesson of the Southern soldier for Carr in 1913 was what they had meant to the quote-unquote welfare of the Anglo-Saxon race during the 4 years immediately succeeding the war, i.e. Reconstruction. Their courage and steadfastness saved the very life of the Anglo-Saxon race in the South, said Carr, when the bottom rail was on top all over the southern states. And today, as a consequence, the purest strain of the Anglo-Saxon is to be found in the 13 southern states. Praise God. I'll turn finally to Harper's Ferry, West Virginia, where Du Bois really fought his most prominent battle with the United Daughters of the Confederacy, who had erected a faithful slave narrative in the town. We have, before that, of course, the decision of the Niagara Movement to go there in 1906, a very, very deliberate and somewhat theatrical decision on the part of Du Bois and his comrades to go to a place and to publicly commemorate the sacrifice of John Brown. You know, John Brown, even though this raid had taken place before the war, had become a kind of battleground for the lost cause. You know, to what extent was he a dangerous, misguided lunatic? To what extent was he what he really was, a kind of a hero and a forerunner of a broader, more national movement for emancipation? Du Bois had the whole program for this meeting sort of built around public commemorations of John Brown, including a barefoot procession around the building, the brick building here, which John Brown hid out in during the raid. The final confrontation with the UDC at Harper's Ferry happened many years later, however, in 1932, where Du Bois returned with the NAACP this time. In many ways, this visit represents the most dramatic, public, and explicit confrontation with the lost cause myth in Du Bois's long career. The choice to return was made in part to offer an opportunity to the faithful slave monument I mentioned a moment ago. These were a useful tool for the lost cause, of course, because they provided an opportunity to assert white supremacist ideas in blackface. The argument of such memorials was that enslaved people were safe and happy, and that emancipation represented a violent upending of the social order. One of the first people killed in the John Brown raid was a free black man, Haywood Shepherd, an employee of the railroad there. He was such a useful tool because he was an innocent victim of this misguided, violent revolutionary act. And so the UDC gathered in October 1931 to dedicate a monument to Haywood Shepherd. It was draped in a Confederate flag, and the podium was decorated with Confederate colors. Henry MacDonald, president of Storr College, which was a black institution nearby, was invited to speak at the dedication. Walter White of the NAACP urged him not to participate, but he did so anyway. One of the most remarkable moments of the ceremony was the unplanned intervention by Pearl Tatum, the musical director of the Storr College's Jubilee Singers, who performed at the event. She said, unprompted, "I am the daughter of a Connecticut volunteer who wore the blue, who fought for the freedom of my people, for which John Brown struck the first blow. Today we are looking forward to the future, forgetting those things of the past. We are pushing forward toward a larger freedom, not in the spirit of the black mammy, but in the spirit of the new freedom and rising youth." These remarks by a black woman who was supposed to remain silent throughout this ceremony were, by all accounts, deeply unwelcome. Washington, D.C. had already been set as the location for the 23rd annual conference of the NAACP. It was decided that a one-day pilgrimage to the historic town of Harper's Ferry would afford the opportunity to provide a, quote, vigorous and appropriate reply to these actions of the UDC. Du Bois was asked to write an inscription for a bronze plaque that would be installed at Storr College and dedicated during the visit. He claimed that the inscription wrote itself. It read, "Here John Brown aimed at human slavery a blow that woke a guilty nation. With him fought 7 slaves and sons of slaves. Over his crucified corpse marched 200,000 black soldiers and 400,000 freemen, singing, 'John Brown's body lies a mouldering in the grave, but his soul goes marching on.'" There were some internal disagreements about the wording of the plaque, some feeling that referring to the crucified corpse was perhaps too inflammatory, but his version stood. It was, however, the decision of the leadership of Storr College not to allow the plaque to be placed on their campus. The outrage and disappointment this must have caused among the members of the NAACP who showed up anyway on May the 21st with the plaque in tow is easy to imagine. It's also palpable in the speech which Du Bois gave to justify his words and which he used to pour scorn on the lost cause. He described unequivocally the landscape of historical distortion in the United States as personified by the Shepherd Monument. Quote, "We have been rewriting recently the history of the United States, and the children here at Storer College, and you who are larger children, and the children throughout the United States are being taught that after all slavery was not evil, that everybody connected with it was good, that everybody was trying to do the right thing, but unfortunately the wrong thing was done. So that all we have to remember is the right that people wanted to do and not the wrong they did. And I was trying to aim a blow at that lie." In one of the few incidents where he refers to it directly, he then takes aim at the lost cause, as well as the UDC. "I know there are people," said Du Bois, "here at Storer College and round about who believe in the lost cause, people who suffered in the Civil War just as much as those who won. Nevertheless, their cause was lost, and it ought to have been lost. And it does not make any difference what the daughters of the Confederacy say here or elsewhere. It remains true that you cannot make the defense of human slavery heroic. There is no way in which you can write history so as to make it heroic." Du Bois dedicated the rest of the speech to describing the role black people, including the hundreds of thousands of soldiers without whom that war could not have been won, played in their own emancipation and justifying their inclusion on the rejected plaque. He concluded his speech by condemning the college's decision. "I'm sorry that Storer College and its trustees and its president did not have the courage to have the memorial left here. I'm not sorry for myself. I know about John Brown. I'm sorry for these students here and the students that are coming, because after all, it is the truth in the long run that makes us free." Now, I was going to do a whole section here on the lost cause and anti-capitalism, going right back to his baccalaureate disquisition, where he talks about Jefferson Davis as representing the strong man. But he talks a lot in his late career, especially as Du Bois is put on trial, for his peace activism, for his increasing embrace of left-wing ideologies. About the ways in which the lost cause can apply itself to contemporary or to then contemporary efforts to disenfranchise people throughout the world. In a 1952 article called "The Confederate Flag," he said, "I'm sure that most people forget just what the Confederate flag once stood for. It stood for human slavery. It was the flag of the slave states of the South who fought against the free labor states of the North in a civil war which was a rebellion against the power of the federal government to regulate land and labor. To me, naturally, the stars and bars of the Confederacy are more than insult, they are a threat, because they signify the slavery of 4 million Negro slaves whose descendants number 15 million American second-class citizens today. The Confederate flag," writes Du Bois, "stood for black slavery in 1860. It stands today for slavery of black and white, and it is ready to support slavery of black, brown, and yellow whenever and wherever the lords of private profit call in Europe, Africa, or Asia." Heather Cox Richardson, in her 2020 book, How the South Won the Civil War, Oligarchy, Democracy, and the Continuing Fight for the Soul of America, makes this link between the lost cause and American oligarchy. The oligarchs, she writes, convinced they should alone rule, set about to destroy democracy. Their rise depends on the successful divorce of image from reality in political narrative. Scott Henkel, another Du Bois fellow, has pointed out from this very lecture the many instances in Black Reconstruction where Du Bois uses the term oligarchy and its derivatives, and has characterized Du Bois's history of Reconstruction as not just a chronicle of a fight against racism, but of one of the most vigorous challenges to American capitalism in this country's history as well. And it's with us in the present. We have right now an ongoing fight over historical memory, over truth in history, but also in the present, personified by the current leadership of the Republican Party and many other elements on the far right, that is being used to justify the actions of really an oligarchy. One of Du Bois's final statements on this is written in his posthumously published autobiography. "The use of history for distortion and not for education has led to another of our greatest present evils, that is to make fear of socialism and communism so great that we have withdrawn our efforts toward the education of children, the war on disease, and the raising of the standards of living." I'm going to get away from those images for a second. The dedication right here at UMass in 1980 of the Du Bois papers, Lerone Bennett said, Dr. Du Bois raised in his lifetime and he raises in his papers the fundamental question of the meaning of scholarship. What is scholarship for? Can scholarship serve the many instead of the few? And I will just finish with not having completely rounded out the ideas in this end of the lecture with a quote from the speech which I began the talk with, which I think speaks to why it's important to go back to Du Bois. And it's where King says, the truths he revealed are not yet the property of all Americans, but they have been recorded and they arm us for our contemporary battles. And with that, and with apologies for going slightly over time, I will conclude and ask if you have any questions. Thank you. There's a problem with this talk is I keep researching it. And so it grows. And I've got more notes here than I really should have. I could be a better editor. Oh, Wilton, yes, please.
Yeah, I'm not going to ask a question because we don't have time, but I appreciate that you started and ended with MLK because of, and just thinking about the notion of propaganda, how both of them, out of both of their stories is often written their anti-capitalism, which is, a foundational part of so much of their like political work. But then also the other thing that I really am grateful for is this, that you brought up was the notion of social truth, and how truth becomes a thing that's agreed upon socially. We already see the kind of rewriting of a genocide happening in the present moment with Palestine. Yeah. We already see the kind of rewriting of the impacts of expanded technological capitalism with AI like being rewritten. And then lastly, so I'm grateful for those things. And then the other thing is also the notion of propaganda not always only as a negative thing. Right. That propaganda and propagation exists as a family of words. So yeah, just want to say that I'm grateful for those things. And yeah, I'll stop here.
Well, my gratitude is reciprocated, as always, Wilton. But yeah, no, the idea of, this is what the talk was trying to say, is that on one hand, Du Bois is taking to this academic writing with full array of research. And I forgot to mention in the Black Reconstruction slide, of course, that, so much of the research is done by Irene Diggs, who I wish I could have had more time to talk about. There she is, Du Bois's research assistant, invaluable efforts that she made to not just collect information, but to organize it for Du Bois and to really help him out. This is not a lone struggle, but the point really that I was making is that in an academic world where the cards are arranged, are stacked against him, Du Bois is fighting this insurgent academic struggle that culminates in many ways in Black Reconstruction, but doesn't end there by any means. But then he also, as on a parallel track, is doing the work of propaganda that you mentioned. That he is producing, fictionalized or literary accounts in the souls of Black folk, or in the pageant, or in more sort of journalistic, accessible writing in the Crisis, or just acts of public theater, like at Harper's Ferry. And that, in many ways, this should be two separate talks, but I like to bring them together to show that, if you really sort of take a year-by-year look at Du Bois's life, it's hard to imagine that he wasn't in some ways thinking about this specific distortion and lie, this big lie at one point throughout his whole career. So anyway, other questions? We have time. We have 15 minutes, so please fire away. Yes.
One thing I've found, so I married a man from Alabama, so I learned a lot about the live of the South, just traveling down there. But I grew up in New England. We don't really talk about the Civil War as much at all in New England. We talk about the Revolution all the time. It was a piping drum band on every corner this year. But we never talk, we really don't talk about the war the role of the North in the Civil War. I don't think we raised up heroes. I know there was the GAR and then kind of disappeared. But in the South, you still have all of these.
Oh, gotcha. I mean, you drive anywhere, and especially in Virginia, where the stuff happened in Virginia and Georgia and so on. It's every roadside is just peppered with different monuments, with flags, with commemoration. Stonewall Jackson slept here one night. It was amazing. Come and touch the relic. Be part of this civic religion. It has that religious quality, and like a religion, it has to be passed down and taught and drummed into you through the methods I mentioned. And I think this 19th century idea of white identity is one that still informs the country nationally. It has so many different paradigms: the frontiersman, the cowboy, the soldier. But the soldier has come, as I mentioned, with General Patton, who was a World War II general. That military tradition has sort of come out of the Confederacy in this twisted way more than it's come out of the Union, even though as an army of citizen soldiers doing a job that they didn't want to do, but they felt that they needed to do, the Union Army in many ways stands as a great testament to this country's martial history, and the fact that they voted in, a majority of them voted not for their former General McClellan in the election of 1864, but for Lincoln, who was going to continue the war, I think tells a better story. It's so often the case that there's just as an inspirational and just as heroic and also crucially true story to be found in the counter-narrative to these myths. And that's, I think, what Du Bois is trying to say, is like, the truth is great too. Like, this is a wonderful tale, and we should tell it. Yes?
So I would argue that we need to stop saying that this is only happening in the South.
Oh, yes.
Because I see many Confederate flags in New York, New England, Connecticut. I'm sorry, Connecticut is part of New England, right?
Yes.
So, but yeah, and the myth of us and them.
Yeah.
And I feel like as being from the North, moving to the South, recognizing the ways in which people interact with each other, is the honesty of when you know someone doesn't like you. And then coming back home, I recognized the racism that I had grown up with my entire life in New York City. And, the idea of country music and Confederate flags, you wear your X and I'll wear mine. That's my favorite t-shirt. And I saw that at a party that was Virginia. So the idea that, I think it's easier for, the abolitionist North, right, to have a sense of us and them. Yeah. But the irony is in this moment, right, in the North, we're seeing the erasure of African American heritage sites, and yet in places like Alabama and Mississippi and Louisiana, we're seeing the survival of Black historic museums, plantations being repurchased by Black people and telling a very different story. So I think, and then the Great Migration going back home. There's a lot of people who, I'm a granddaughter of the Great Migration, but yet I have cousins that they all live in the South now. And so I think it's a really interesting way in which I see, I don't know, I don't trust any, it's the USA.
Well, this is the thing, as I mentioned, the project of the Lost Cause became initially, I think, the kind of rehabilitation of the South and the sort of survival strategy of a local white supremacy. But then to really bring that home, it helped to create a framework that could be engaged in by the whole country. And of course, the whole country eagerly engaged in this. Despite my praise of the Union soldier earlier, this is nonetheless, and has always been a country nationally built on racial lines. Because how else can you justify the removal of non-white people from their ancestral lands unless through some spurious claim to superiority and entitlement? And I think what's interesting about that regional kind of distillation of the Lost Cause now beyond the South is that it does sort of map onto the cultural world. It does map onto the electoral map. So it crosses the Mason-Dixon line. And Richard Slotkin in his book, National Myth and the Battle for America, which came out a couple of years ago, he says that the Lost Cause and MAGA are completely joined together, because even though Trump doesn't know anything about American history, doesn't really know anything about the Lost Cause, couldn't grasp it, he has a sort of instinctive sense of it, and so too do his followers. He talks about that, Slotkin says, Red State America is a paradise lost, a temple polluted, a second lost cause requiring a second redemption. That's what triumphed in 2016. And so he actually says what I just said, Trump lacks the historical knowledge to deliberately invoke its symbolism, but it follows the paradigm by calling for political insurrection against a regime that subordinates real, quote unquote, Americans. So it's this, it's this continual thing in our own time. The lost cause is there, and that's why we have to go back to what Jamel Bowie wrote about this in 2022. He said, "I return to Du Bois because he offers a framework that is useful for analyzing the struggle for democracy in our own time," and that's happening all over the place. Andreas.
Do you want to go first?
You mentioned January 6th earlier.
Yes.
It made me think about how that's another event that has been so effectively rewritten.
Yeah.
And it happened so quickly. It only took a couple weeks for a lot of people to talk about how it was either peaceful, or that people there were paid leftist actors or Antifa.
Yeah.
And it kind of, I feel like the process of us, of the truth just being so totally overturned has accelerated in recent years. I don't know if you have anything to speak about.
Well, I think, thank you, because actually there's one other point I wanted to make, which is that the useful thing for Trump and MAGA and any kind of post-truth populist actor now is that the lost cause is a fabulous example of a big lie becoming accepted fact. And that you can just brazenly tell a lie, knowing yourself that it is wrong, knowing that the people you are speaking to know that what you're saying is wrong, but it's the old thing of, we can do it and get away with it. And so that's why those statues are so poisonous, because they were standing there telling Black Americans that no, actually they had not been freed. No, the South had not lost the Civil War, and so on. So this is where the lost cause is a wonderful template for people hoping to live a lie, to perpetuate a lie, and that's why it's so fascinating, of course, that one of the symbols that was most visible on January 6th was the Confederate flag. I'll go away from these images again. Sorry. I like this one. Oops. Oh God, what have I done? My penultimate slide here. This is from the protests in Charlottesville, Virginia, in 2017, which were violent, but and where people were killed because of a removal of a Confederate monument. But I love this banner because it says, "Screw the Klan, the Confederacy, and the cops," against white supremacy. And of course, this is what the Lee Monument looked like before it was torn down, in case anyone is in doubt about the potency of, and perhaps maybe why it was torn down. I don't know, because it became a rallying point for BLM. Anyway, Andreas.
Yeah, thanks. So super great talk, super far-reaching. I think two brief things I wanted to say. First, great that you started with the line of the King's speech. I wish you'd go to the different part of it, which is where he talks about lost cause as a poisonous fog of lies. It seeps through the nation. That seems like a really good end to what you're trying to say, right? It is this fog that kind of we can make. It's this fog of untruth that proponents can make what they want it to make, right? Make out what they want to make out of it. It's the lost cause that seeps into some of the contemporary resonance that you have in it. So just sort of I guess one comment would say, use that bit of the speech. It fits your talk perfectly.
Editorial note accepted.
And the other thing that I wanted to say, I think, is to sort of whether you want to say a little bit more about. I think a big part of what it was just saying is, as I read Black Reconstruction and the propaganda history specifically, is he wants to sort of mark this division between what he calls the work of the historian as scientist, and the work of the historian as prophet or as philosopher. Mm-hmm. This distinction is that as scientist, the role of the historian is to meticulously outline a set of facts about what happened.
Yeah.
And once we can all agree on the facts, we then have the historian as prophet or empathetic or as a philosopher, he would interpret the facts. He makes his point about somewhere in propaganda history, I can't remember exactly where. But what's interesting, I think, is that, and he wants to basically say, I think, that the people at the Dunning School have essentially presented a prophetic history as a factual history, and this is why it goes wrong. This is why it's problematic for anti-democratic reasons, and all the reasons that you stipulated. But I suppose what's interesting is that Du Bois, in a way, in Black Reconstruction itself, although entirely factual, is also an exercise in interpretation. It's an exercise in prophetic history, an exercise in trying to say, this is a narrative that we can tell about Black history that centers African Americans in their own history, that speaks to the causes of the present. I suppose I wonder if you could say something about the method of history that Du Bois was using. He was writing Black Reconstruction and other things, and maybe how that method of history, although it's committed to a division between fact and interpretation, where is that division of fact and interpretation? What that tells us about propaganda? If that makes any sense.
Yeah, I think I understand the question, which is that there is that question. Well, what makes Du Bois's history acceptable? Why do we not? If he's saying, "I'm here to present this version of the fact," there are all those quotes in the outline. I'm going to tell the truth. I'm going to do. Well, who made you the arbiter of what's truthful and not truthful? I think the reason Black Reconstruction is so long is in part because this is Du Bois providing receipts. Doing his showing his working. I'm giving you this interpretation. He says, I'm going to write this as literature. I'm going to make this a gripping narrative. But anyone who's read Black Reconstruction knows there are passages where you go, oh, right, yes, okay, another example, right? Another huge quote of a report by Carl Schurz or a huge long deliberation in Congress. Why? Because these are irrefutable primary sources that need to be brought to bear because otherwise a reader could just go, well, that's just Du Bois's opinion. And he's doing the opposite of what this sort of selective cherry picking and also absolute just muting of other parts of history that the Dunning School have done to give a full kind of picture of what's actually going on. And that's why I think I tell a lot of people to read Reconstruction and its benefits, because in that shorter piece, he does that classic thing of, here's the argument as laid out by anti-Reconstruction historians, here's why I think it's wrong, here's the evidence. And it's just, that's why I say he pulls his punches a bit, because it's a bit more gentle than Black Reconstruction, which really kind of goes in with that big kind of wrecking ball of literary energy, especially in those early chapters, where the Dawn of Freedom and so on, where he just lets his full kind of poetic juices fly. But I think that the fundamental exercise in Black Reconstruction is still to take as many sources as he can, and he had to cut a bunch of it, and there was loads he couldn't get his hands on because archives were barred to him. He couldn't travel to everywhere he wanted to go. Irene Diggs could only do so much. There's a lot that could be in there that wasn't, but fundamentally, I think one of the reasons we can see Du Bois's text as so different is that the Bowers work that builds on the Dunning School it's just a clone of a previous interpretation. Same with all the military histories of the Civil War written by Lost Cause friendly people, whether that's in our own time or in the 1960s. They are just remakings of what's gone before. Du Bois sets a new precedent and sets, as Gerald Horne points out, a new process in motion by which honest histories can be written. And that's really the great gift that he gives us, is just a body of work to draw on as we continue our own work and think with Du Bois, but also beyond what he was capable of. It is now 1:30, and I've got my second group here coming in, so I've got to ask you folks to either send me your questions or whatever, because we're out of time. Sorry. Thank you so much.